Hi, everybody. My name is Carl Blair, and I am the Texas Civil Rights Project's Senior Election Protection Attorney. And so thank you so much for being here tonight. Have some very special guest speakers with us tonight. And so tonight is the last of our presentations in our Democracy Deep Dive series. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our presentation. And again, thank you so much for being here. All right, and just let me know if everybody can see my slideshow. Just verbal will be fine. Got that? Perfect. All right. So just so everybody knows, while I'm in sharing mode, I can't see the chat. Fortunately, I have my amazing colleague Laderica with me, and she's going to be keeping chat. Anybody who comes in a little bit after the presentation begins, she's going to admit them to the presentation. So Laderica, thank you so much for being here tonight as well. Tonight's presentation is on UOCAVA, and this is the very short version. We'll obviously get into this in more detail. Very short version that this is the law that allows service members and U.S. citizens who live abroad the ability to vote by mail in federal and state elections. I'm joined tonight by Brittany Kewington and John Kamen from our great partners over at Common Defense. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and their organization a little bit later in the presentation. But thank you both, Brittany and John, for being here so much. It's really a pleasure and an honor to get to talk with you and have this discussion with you tonight. All right, so for anybody who doesn't know about the Texas Civil Rights Project, we are a nonpartisan 501c3. We're a nonprofit. We were founded in 1990. We currently have 3 teams. We have a Beyond Borders team. They deal with border and immigration issues. Our criminal legal team deals with criminal justice issues. And then the team that Laderic and I are part of is our voting rights team. And we deal with voting rights and election protection issues. At our voting rights team, we say that we advocate for Texas voters through every step of the voting process. As I mentioned, this is the final presentation in our Democracy Deep Dive series. As you can see by this slide, we've talked about a lot of different topics tonight, or this last month. Texas voter registration laws, election resource allocation, voting machines, and tonight, UOCAVA. We are posting videos and recordings of all of these presentations on our YouTube channel. You can see the link at the bottom of that slide. It gives this one about a day or two, and it should be on our YouTube channel by the end of the week. We do want to give a special shout out and thanks to the American Constitution Society, and specifically their Austin, DFW, and Houston chapters for being very generous sponsors of this presentation series. I posted a link to their website there. We take every chance we can to get to work with them. They're a fantastic organization. All right, so now we can kind of get into the actual presentation itself. We got through the housekeeping stuff, so let's figure out what we're going to be talking about tonight. So we're going to start with a history of absentee voting in the United States. I think it's really important for this issue to give a lot of historical context and background before we dive into the actual nuts and bolts of UOCAVA. So after we talk about that history, we're going to talk about the actual nuts and bolts of UOCAVA. How does this law actually work? How is it supposed to work? And then I'm going to hand the floor over to Brittany and John, and they're going to introduce themselves, their organization, Common Defense, and talk about some issues about how UOCAVA and this absentee voting process actually works on the ground for members of our armed forces. All right, so let's start with the history of absentee voting. We're going to cover a lot of different portions of American history. We're going to start with the pre-Civil War era. We're going to jump to the Civil War, World War II, post-war era. We're going to talk about UOCAVA itself. And then we're going to wrap up with a brief discussion about absentee voting over the last 25 years or so. All right, so, if you've seen some of our other presentations, we don't really get the chance to tell a lot of history or stories in most of our presentations. But tonight, I did want to start with a story. So the year 1775, it's a small town of Hollis, New Hampshire. About 1,200 people are citizens of that town, and about 100 of them are fighting in the Revolutionary War that started just a few months ago. So one afternoon, a courier came to town. They brought a letter from some of the soldiers from Hollis. That, in and of itself, not unusual. The town was used to getting reports about what was happening on the front lines, letters to loved ones who were left behind. This letter had a little bit of a different twist, though. The courier brought the letter to the leaders of the town elders. They opened it up, read it, and it was a rather unusual request. These soldiers who wrote this letter were requesting that they be allowed to vote in a local election that was going on at that time. And they actually provided a list of the votes that they wanted to cast in that election. So the town leaders called a special town meeting. There were arguments made for counting the votes. There were arguments made for not counting the votes. But at the end of the day, the town decided to count the votes as if the men were present themselves. And so that is actually one of the first recorded and documented cases of absentee voting in the United States, which actually predates the United States. So, and I want to be clear, to be fair, during the Revolutionary War era, this idea of absentee voting was not widespread, but it was present in some places. Hollis wasn't the only place where this happened. There were other sporadic examples of localities allowing Continental soldiers to vote while away from their homes. Like I said, not widespread, but the seed of an idea of absentee voting was there from the very beginning of our nation. So jump ahead about 80 years to the Civil War era. In 1813, in the middle of the War of 1812, Pennsylvania became the first state to allow service members to vote absentee if they were stationed more than 2 miles away from their home. So the 1860s roll around. By the end of 1861, so just a few months after the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, 6 Confederate states had provided service members some form of absentee voting. Next year, Missouri became the first Union state to allow absentee voting for its soldiers in the middle of the war. And then in 1864, just a few months before the war ended, 7 Confederate states and 19 Union states had allowed for absentee voting for their soldiers. So this was the first widespread use of absentee voting in U.S. history. Before that point, you had sporadic examples. In Pennsylvania, War of 1812 ended rather shortly after Pennsylvania passed that law allowing absentee votes from soldiers. But the Civil War represented the very first widespread use of absentee voting. It did, however, spark a slow implementation of absentee voting for some civilians as well after the war. So jump ahead another 80 years after that to World War II. And this marks the first major attempt by the federal government itself to actually facilitate military voting. And this came after sustained encouragement from President Roosevelt and Vice President Truman that publicly encouraged military voting. So this led to the passage in 1942 of the Soldier Voting Act. This allowed all members of the military who were overseas to cast their ballots from abroad, but importantly, it expired at the end of the war. This law also marked the first time that a federal postcard application, or an FPCA, was created. And this FPCA, it allowed the soldiers to request an absentee ballot and allowed them to vote for presidential electors and candidates for the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House. We will be talking about the FPCA extensively throughout this presentation because a version of it still exists in UOCAVA today. There was one major outstanding question that the Soldier Voting Act didn't address, left it open, and that was whether these service members could vote in state elections. So at the time, that was left up to the individual states to decide on their own. So jump forward a little bit longer, 1955, the Federal Voting Assistance Act was passed, and it created what's known as the Federal Voting Assistance Program. And it was created to assist service members, their families, and U.S. citizens living outside the U.S. with registering to vote and voting absentee, and recommended but did not require that states allow these groups to register and vote for state and local elections as well. In 1968, the Federal Voting Assistance Act was amended to include a more general provision, which applied to U.S. citizens who are temporarily residing outside of the U.S. So you can see we are still going through an expansion of the use of absentee voting at this time. So 1975 was the next big step, and that's when the Overseas Citizens Voting Rights Act was passed. And this was the first federal guarantee that U.S. citizens living outside the U.S. could register and vote absentee in federal elections. And that was whether or not they maintained a U.S. residence or they had an intention to return to the U.S. So all of that background gets us up to 1986 when UOCAVA is finally passed. It's the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act. It was signed by President Reagan in 1986. And the way that the system was set up at the time was it was administered by the Secretary of Defense. And ever since it was passed, the Secretary of Defense has delegated the day-to-day administration of UOCAVA to the director of the Federal Voting Assistance Program. So much like the FPCA, we'll also be hearing about the Federal Voting Assistance Program throughout this presentation as well. So UOCAVA officially repealed the Federal Voting Assistance Act of 1955 and the Overseas Citizens Voting Rights Act of 1972. However, it carried over several provisions from both of those laws. It's subsequently been amended a number of times. The National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2002, the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, of 2002 as well, the Ronald Reagan Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2005, the John Warner National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2007, and the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act, or the MOVE Act, of 2009. So when we were going through the nuts and bolts of UOCAVA, it has been built up since 1942 in the Soldier Voting Act. It's been amended multiple times. So it is a real relic and real example of, a history of expanding the franchise in this particular realm of absentee voting. And as we'll see, it has some issues that voters face. It has some issues that both our military members and U.S. citizens abroad face. But it is also built and has been amended before. So it is an amalgamation of all of that history, this background that we've been going over. All right, last stop on our history of absentee voting, jump to the 2000s. So in 2000, Oregon became the first state to become exclusively vote by mail. They were joined by Washington and Colorado in the 2010s. And as we remember, in 2020, during the COVID pandemic, states across the country relaxed their absentee voting laws for the 2020 presidential election. And this so far has been the high water mark of the number of ballots that were cast by mail. So approximately 43% of all ballots cast in the 2020 presidential election were by mail. That ended up being a little bit over 68.1 million votes. Also in 2020, Hawaii and Utah switched to all vote by mail systems themselves. Last year, approximately 30.3% of all ballots cast were by mail. That is, was still 51.2 million votes. So 2020 is definitely an outlier in the number for understandable reasons. 2024 is more in line with historical numbers. However, the trend has been going up over multiple decades at this point in time. And then ongoing, we still know that there are disputes about the use of absentee voting. Some are fueled by misinformation or disinformation, others by conspiracy theories. And these disputes continue to this day, again, despite no evidence of any large-scale voter fraud ever being proven. And so with that kind of history, that context, that background, kind of seeing how UOCAVA was built from legislation and the situations that led up to that, to its passage in 1986, let's go ahead and jump into the actual nuts and bolts of how UOCAVA is supposed to work. So we're going to talk about some basics. Then we're going to actually go into depth about how the registration and voting process actually works. We're going to discuss President Trump's March 2025 executive order. Section of that order deals specifically with changing the way that UOCAVA is functioning. We're going to talk about some 2024 general election numbers, how many UOCAVA voters were there, how many ballots were cast through UOCAVA. And then we're going to mention some unique problems that UOCAVA voters can face. And once we get to that portion, I'm going to hand over the floor to Brittany and John so they can talk about themselves, their organization, and the life experiences and real world experiences that they and their members can bring to this issue. So let's jump into some basics here. So I would like everybody to kind of keep two thoughts in mind as we're going through the rest of this presentation. The first is that all 50 states and DC and territories like the Virgin Islands, Guam, Puerto Rico, they all maintain their authority to set their own registration and voter eligibility requirements as long as those requirements comply with federal laws like the Voting Rights Act. So even though UOCAVA is here, these jurisdictions are covered by UOCAVA, they still have the authority to set their own registration and eligibility requirements. So that's the first note that we want to take in, that we want everybody to keep in mind. Second is I want everybody to keep in mind the elections clause of the US Constitution. I'm just going to go ahead and quote it verbatim. The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations. And this is going to come in really important when we talk about President Trump's executive order, because the executive order is demanding that changes be made to UOCAVA. Whereas the elections clause clearly shows that it is Congress who has the authority to make changes to laws such as UOCAVA. The president doesn't have that unilateral authority on his own. So just keep those two thoughts in mind as we go through the rest of this presentation. And then I think that they will really help kind of guide and elucidate some of the issues that we're going to talk about throughout this presentation. All right, so first question that I want to kind of address is what jurisdictions are covered by UOCAVA? Where does UOCAVA apply? So UOCAVA covers all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the territories of American Samoa, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. For historical reasons, it doesn't cover the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, but it does cover all of those other jurisdictions. And so the second question I want to go over is, who does UOCAVA protect? Who does it cover? So it covers two distinct categories of voters, and collectively you'll see them referred to as UOCAVA voters. So the first category are uniformed service voters and certain dependents. So who does that mean? Who does that apply to? It applies to active duty service members who are away from their voting residence. And so this is members of the Air Force, the Army, Coast Guard, Marine Corps, Navy, Space Force, but it also includes members of the U.S. Merchant Marines and commissioned officers of the U.S. Public Health Service and the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. So this is the first time, this next bullet point is the first time where we're going to see how states handle UOCAVA differently. Some states have extended UOCAVA protections to their National Guard members. Some states allow those protections if their National Guard members are deployed on federal orders, but not state orders. Some of them extend protections to National Guard members regardless of whether they're on federal or state orders. So like I said, this is one of the first times where we can see different states applying UOCAVA protections differently. Importantly, this category of voters also covers service members' spouses and their dependents who are away from their voting residence due to the service member's service. So that's how military spouses and children who would be eligible to vote, that would cover them as well. So what's the other category of voters? They're overseas voters. And these voters aren't covered by the uniformed services category, but they are still covered by UOCAVA as they're American citizens who reside abroad, but remain eligible to vote in the U.S. at their voting residence. So just some examples, federal employees who are stationed in foreign countries, so think your foreign service, U.S. citizens who live abroad, expats, and students who are studying abroad. So those are some of the categories of overseas voters that are covered by UOCAVA. One other concept that I want to talk about right now is what a voting residence means in UOCAVA terms. So voting residence, simply put, it's the location in which a voter registers and casts a ballot. Now, obviously, the specific location, the specific voter residence is going to change varied on a voter's conditions, but generally it's going to be one of two places. It's either going to be the last U.S. location where the person lived, that means where they were domiciled and where they were eligible to vote, or the permanent U.S. address where the voter is eligible to vote. All right, so now we know where UOCAVA covers, what jurisdictions are covered. We know what voters are covered by UOCAVA. Let's talk about the actual process itself. How does this voting and registration process actually work under UOCAVA? So UOCAVA voters, they're going to follow the same general process as domestic voters who are voting absentee. They're going to register to vote, they're going to request a ballot, and then they're going to return their ballot. Because rules for registering, requesting a ballot, and returning a ballot vary so widely from state to state, the Federal Voting Assistance Program maintains a database of the registration and voting processes for all covered jurisdictions. I included a link to the actual Texas portion of that guide there. But they have a guide for every one of those covered jurisdictions we mentioned a couple of slides ago. So here's where we're going to come back to the federal postcard application that was first created in 1942 under the Soldier Voting Act. So the FPCA is a one-step process that allows UOCAVA voters to temporarily register to vote. And the fact that it temporarily registers people to vote is very important later on. It allows the UOCAVA voters to update their voter registration contact information and request a ballot for all federal elections in that calendar year. And UOCAVA voters can return their FPCA by mail, fax, or email. So how are FPCAs handled here in Texas? So in Texas, the FPCAs are sent to the early voting clerk of the voter's county. They can be received any time of the voting year, January, December, any time of the year. They do expire after 2 federal elections from the date on which the FPCA is received. So the question of what type of ballot a voter gets is partially dependent on when their postcard application is actually received by the early voting clerk. So if the FPCA that they send in is received no later than the 20th day before election, they're going to be given a full ballot. That's going to include all federal, all state, all local races. If their FPCA gets to their early voting clerk between 19 and 7 days before the election, they're going to receive only a federal ballot. And then any FPCAs that are received after the 7th day before the election, they're not going to be given a ballot for that election. You can see the FPCA ballot tracker that the Secretary of State's office runs. That was one of the amendments, one of the changes that came about by the MOVE Act in 2009. States were required to maintain some type of system for UOCAVA voters to track their FPCAs and their ballots as well. So typically, if a voter in Texas requests a ballot by mail, they file something called an application for a ballot by mail. They're going to have to, if they send it by a fax or email, they also have to mail a hard copy of that application to their county's early voting clerk. And that voting clerk has to get it within 4 days of receiving that fax or that email. However, when it comes to UOCAVA voters, if they email their FPCA, if they email their FPCA in, they don't have to also send that follow-up hard copy. So that's one of the protections for UOCAVA voters in Texas. Ballots to UOCAVA voters must be sent no later than the 45th day before Election Day. If an FPCA is received after that 45-day deadline, the early voting clerk must mail or email the UOCAVA voter their ballot no later than 7 calendar days after receiving their FPCA. All right, so we're going to shift gears here, and we're going to talk about something called a federal write-in absentee ballot. You might see it either abbreviated as FWAB or FWIB. I'm going to use FWAB because that's what it usually is referred to as. So generally, a UOCAVA voter is going to receive the exact same mail-in ballot as a non-UOCAVA voter in the same jurisdiction will, right? However, UOCAVA provides for an emergency backup in the form of the federal write-in absentee ballot, or the FWAB. So these are used in cases where a UOCAVA voter either didn't receive their official ballot in time to cast their vote, or their completed ballot wasn't received by their election officials. So that's why it's an emergency backup. And UOCAVA requires generally that states accept FWABs unless a state has specifically been granted approval to use their own version of the FWAB. Texas hasn't received that approval. I wasn't even able to find if they had ever requested that type of approval. So Texas uses these FWABs that are created by the Federal Voting Assistance Program. FWABs in Texas are going to include all federal races, and they may also include state and county races as well. And this is another point where, you might get a federal ballot, or you might get a federal, state, and local ballot as well. It just depends on the specific voter's circumstances. If the UOCAVA voter has indicated that they don't intend to return to the U.S., or they're unsure about returning to the U.S., they're only going to receive a federal ballot. It's important to know that for UOCAVA voters in Texas, they also have to submit an FPCA either before or at the same time as their federal write-in absentee ballot for that ballot to count. And then these absentee ballots can only be returned by mail or fax. The fax option is only available for military voters who are in recognized hostile fire areas or designated combat zones. All right, and let's talk about UOCAVA ballot deadlines. This is obviously a very big issue for voters who are living overseas. So for the overseas voter category, their ballots must be postmarked by election day and received by their county elections office no later than the 5th day after election day. And for uniformed service voters, their ballot must be received by the 6th day after election day. If a ballot's not received by the applicable deadline, whether it's an overseas voter or a uniformed service voter, their ballot is going to be rejected. For non-federal write-in absentee ballot UOCAVA ballots, they can only be returned by mail or fax. The fax option is still only available to military voters in hostile fire areas or designated combat zones. And then just something I wanted to note, for everybody to keep in mind as we talk about numbers. Texas actually has the 5th most UOCAVA voters in the country. Last year, there were over 65,000 UOCAVA voters who registered to vote in Texas. So tens of thousands of our fellow Texans we're talking about here. The FVAP provides a general timeline of the UOCAVA voting process. We're not going to go through every single column here, but step 1, register and request an absentee ballot using the FPCA. They recommend that be done in January of each year. Then step 2, of course, would be to receive the absentee ballot from their state elections office. That's typically going to be 45 to 30 calendar days before the election. And then regardless of how, whether you use the actual non-federal write-in absentee ballot or whether you do have to use a federal write-in absentee ballot, the FVAP suggestion is that the UOCAVA voter fill their ballot out as soon as possible. So just to recap some federal responsibilities. So both the federal government and state governments share responsibilities in administering and running UOCAVA. So the federal responsibilities side, like we mentioned before, the Secretary of Defense administers UOCAVA, and they've delegated the daily responsibilities to the director of the FVAP. The FVAP's director also coordinates with the U.S. Postal Service to develop procedures to expedite the delivery of completed ballots. The FVAP also produces and distributes the federal postcard application and the federal write-in absentee ballots, and they consult with state election officials about how to meet their UOCAVA requirements. And then finally, the Department of Justice enforces compliance with UOCAVA through litigation. On the state side, states have to permit UOCAVA voters to vote and use absentee registration procedures in federal elections. States have to accept and process voter registration and absentee ballot applications if the voter makes a ballot request at least 30 days before the election. States have to transmit absentee ballots to UOCAVA voters no later than 45 days before a federal election. States also have to transmit those ballots requested less than 45 days before a federal election, if practical, at the state's discretion and in accordance with state laws. So this is another example where we would see different states handling UOCAVA responsibilities slightly differently. States also have to establish procedures for sending the UOCAVA ballots by mail or electronically. They also have to provide UOCAVA voters with an option to select a preferred transmission method. The voter gets to say, I would rather have my ballot mailed to me or emailed to me. And then they also have to send blank ballots either electronically or make them available online when a UOCAVA voter requests that. And then lastly, the states can't reject otherwise validly completed federal write-in absentee ballots solely because they don't meet a state's requirement for envelope size or type, paperweight, or notarization. Some states require absentee ballots to be notarized. Others require that they be a specific paperweight or placed into a specific type of envelope. But states are not allowed to reject validly completed FWABs because they don't meet one of those requirements. All right, so now we're going to shift gears completely out of UOCAVA and over to the executive order that President Trump issued in March of this year. Very, very briefly, what is an executive order? It's an official directive from the president that manages the operations of the federal government. So it instructs the federal government how to implement a specific bill that's been passed by Congress, but executive orders are not legislation. Also, executive orders can't override or preempt federal laws or statutes, and they can be challenged in court, overridden by an act of Congress, or rescinded when another president takes office. So on March 25th, 2025, President Trump issued Executive Order 14248 entitled Preserving and Protecting the Integrity of American Elections. In Section 3D1 of that states, the Secretary of Defense shall update the federal postcard application pursuant to the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act to require documentary proof of U.S. citizenship. So what is documentary proof of citizenship, or commonly abbreviated as DPOC? These are requirements that individuals provide documentary proof of their U.S. citizenship in addition to completing a voter registration form. So President Trump's executive order cited specific documents that would meet this requirement. They include a U.S. passport, an ID document that's compliant with the requirements of the Real ID Act, that indicates that the applicant is a citizen of the United States. So think an original or certified copy of a birth certificate, an official military ID card that indicates the applicant's a citizen, or a valid federal or state government issued photo ID if that ID indicates that the applicant is a U.S. citizen, or if that ID is also accompanied by proof of U.S. citizenship. So how would this executive order, if these changes were implemented by the Secretary of Defense, how would these orders and these changes impact UOCAVA voters specifically? Remember that the FPCA only temporarily registers a UOCAVA voter. So if a DPOC requirement were added to the FPCA, it would mean that military and overseas voters would have to submit their citizenship documents every single time they submitted an FPCA. So this is yet another example of the burdens and the costs of voting and the risks for any mistakes that may happen being deliberately and squarely placed on the shoulders of voters. Right, so let's talk about 2024 general election numbers, right? How many UOCAVA ballots were sent? How many were returned? So last year, more than 1.3 million ballots were sent by election officials to UOCAVA voters. 70% were to overseas voters, 30% were to service members and their dependents. Email was the most common method offices used to send ballots to UOCAVA voters, but a majority of ballots sent to service members were transmitted by postal mail. Of those 1.3 million, more than 2/3 were actually returned by voters. We're talking about 866,000 ballots were returned. Postal mail was the most common method for all UOCAVA voters to return their ballots. There's an explanation for that. All states are required to allow UOCAVA voters to mail their ballots back, whereas some states have allowed fax methods or email methods. But again, it's not a surprise that postal method is the most common method because all states are required to allow UOCAVA voters to mail their ballots back. And then very importantly, nationwide, more than 96% of returned UOCAVA ballots were counted, approximately 830,000 votes. The single most common reason for rejecting a UOCAVA ballot was because the ballot was received after the state's deadline for returning ballots. And again, this is just yet another example where wildly different requirements, wildly different deadlines between states can really negatively impact voters here. If we're talking about federal write-in absentee ballots specifically, more than 28,000 of them were submitted last year. More than 20,000 of them were accepted, which meant that 20,000 additional UOCAVA voters were able to have their ballots counted because the federal write-in absentee ballot option was available to them. And of these federal write-in absentee ballots that were counted, nearly 75 of them were received from overseas voters, and approximately 25% were from uniformed service voters. And then the last slide for me, and then I hand the floor over to Brittany and John. Just some problems that UOCAVA voters can face that are kind of unique to their situations. There are wide differences in voting laws and deadlines between states. That is something that UOCAVA voters, that's kind of a problem that they face in a unique manner that other voters wouldn't have to face. International mail delays. They could potentially be located in an area with limited internet accessibility. If we think runoff elections, the timing of a runoff election, like we have runoff elections in Texas, that might make it virtually impossible for a UOCAVA voter to actually vote in a runoff election. There are also partisan challenges to UOCAVA procedures. Just last year, just mere weeks before the presidential election, Republican operatives in North Carolina, Michigan, and Pennsylvania filed lawsuits against how each one of those states were administering and implementing UOCAVA. They did wait to file those lawsuits after the 45-day deadline to send UOCAVA ballots out. And then a lack of information and or misinformation about the UOCAVA voting process also negatively impacts the voters that UOCAVA covers. So with that, I'm going to very happy to introduce Brittany Cuington and John Kamen from our great partners over at Common Defense. So Brittany, John, thank you so much for being here, and I hand you the mic.
Oh, Brittany, you're muted.
Okay, I noticed that like the second sentence says, thank you so much, Ladira But hi, my name is Brittany Cuington. We're so happy to be here and included in this conversation as it has affected us directly, either in the past or still currently with our family members. And just wanted to give like a brief background about who we are at Common Defense before we formally introduce ourselves, our faces. So at Common Defense, we are a 501c3, a 501c4, and a PAC, which means that we get to work in a lot of different spaces. We work across nonprofit, advocacy, and electoral spaces. We are the largest grassroots veterans and military families organization in this country, and we have almost 1,000 members just in Texas alone, and I'm very happy to say that as a Texas lead organizer. Our mission at Common Defense is to organize veterans and engage military families to transform our society by advocating for progressive policies that work for all of us. Very inclusive. Many of our members have served or have been stationed abroad, and they have firsthand experience with absentee voting, and that's what we hope to bring to this conversation with this deep dive. Next slide. Okay, now us. Hi, I am the Texas lead organizer from Common Defense, as I just stated. I am an Air Force veteran and a grassroots strategist in mobilizing veterans and military families across Texas and a little bit of Mexico and New Mexico as well, as we have members there as well, and to defend democracy and expand civic participation. And I'll turn it over to John to introduce himself.
Yes, good evening. My name is John Kamen. I'm the Deputy Director for Government Affairs. So we're primarily out of Washington, D.C., and help better align our grassroots initiatives and vision with practical policy solutions.
Thank you, John. And I'll take it back here for just the next slide or two, and we'll focus on veterans and families that are voting abroad. And like I said, I wanted to provide some like real-time lived experience from some of our members. So the quotes that you see here are actually from our members. I reached out to them in preparing for this deep dive to get their perspective so that they would be included whether they were here physically or not. And I'm so grateful that I had a plethora of quotes to choose from because there was particularly interested in this topic as we've had some interesting full spectrum of experiences with voting abroad while serving. The first one says, I've served in Afghanistan and tried to vote by mail. My ballot arrived weeks after the election day. I felt like my voice didn't count, even though I was risking my life for democracy. To that quote, overseas ballots are often delayed, rejected, or lost in transit. Carl has already alluded to that with the number of ballots that were received just in this past 2024 election and how they were received. Service members and spouses juggle confusing deadlines and state by state rules, and even the state rules change. I've noticed that personally when trying to vote as a Texas resident in the past, and I was only in for 6 years, so I can imagine what it looked like before then. But then even successful voting experiences are, so you can go to the next slide. We'll get into that one. So this one is positive, but still fragile, meaning like we still got some improvement to do. We still got some things to work on. This quote says, I got my ballot by email while deployed. That wasn't in Texas, so I can let you know that. It was one of the few things that made me feel connected to home. And I really, as this member, as a Texas member now, they were a resident in the state of Ohio when they were deployed. So they were able to receive their ballot via email, which is really cool. because it does give you that connection. It does help you feel like you're, providing your civic duty to the country, while still being overseas and serving. So I really, um, I thought that was a cool way of feeling, having that connection to home even when you're not there. Many managed to vote, but only through persistence and sometimes luck. Missed connections, internet outages, which is a real thing because I worked in pop-up communications in the Air Force. So that's a real thing. The internet outage is real. And mail slowdowns can make the process a little bit unpredictable. New barriers could push these fragile successes into outright disenfranchisement, as we have already talked about a little bit before.
Great. Well, thank you, Brittany. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of 14248. And I'll speak a little bit personally for this as well. I just got off of, I was on active duty orders myself from July of 2024 through July of 2025. And I wasn't overseas. I was at CENTCOM in Florida. And my unit received only one briefing on elections, and it was incredibly confusing. It always is. And there was a big presidential election to vote for. And I will just lead with the fact that military is already not in a good place when it comes to understanding the complexities of voting. And I'd also add that on active duty, at least, over half of all active duty members are under the age of 25. In many cases, it would be the first time that they are voting. And we do view the impact of this as having a effect of further complicating what is already a very flawed system when it comes to allowing service members to vote. And to the quote that you see where we don't carry our birth certificates into combat, adding new proof requirements makes it easier to block us and include us. This is, even the other day, I had to send my birth certificate up for Army business, and I realized, damn it, I don't know what happened. I moved recently, and it took me a while to find it. If you're overseas, that's not an option. And also, when you're overseas, there is some confusion over what constitutes voter ID and how that's being asserted. First, it is interesting that the executive order states that amongst the ID you can use to transmit is your military ID. Because and as a senior non-commissioned officer myself, this is what I have to tell my soldiers constantly. If you take a photocopy of your military ID, you are subject to UCMJ action. That is considered a sensitive document. You are never to use that to check for ID, except for at military gates and when you're plugging into computers. That is not proof of, you do not provide that for proof. And that is out of the picture, so it never should have been in the order in the first place and further complicates what people think they should do. Another thing, a basic reality that folks have, though, is that if a soldier stationed at Fort Hood, maybe they were at Fort Hood for 4 years, but they got their driver's license in Arizona. And, they've been on a lease for a couple of years. They're paying Texas taxes, but they're like, oh, well, can I vote? Because you're asking me for my ID. Can't give you my military because that's illegal. And the only state one I have is a driver's license from another state. So it further confuses the matter in a way that, again, is already pretty challenging. Let's go to the next slide. Here's what our perspective is. If you fight for democracy, you should be able to vote in one. And we remain at the front line of protecting democracy. That's what we sign up to do. There are still rotations we do downrange. I have people in my unit that are deploying to the Middle East at the beginning of the year. And these are still happening. Not necessarily as many kinetic zones, as many hostile fire areas, but we have troops stationed all over the globe. And we must be able to prioritize their inclusion. And in terms of the UOCAVA changes, the areas that we view most threatening are obviously what we first talked about when it comes to this additional proof of what they called citizenship as well, which is going to delay and complicate registration. Also, it's just a certainty that the strict receipt by election day rule for this executive order is going to result in more discounted votes for absolutely no reason. And lastly, that this executive order is setting a framework for states to apply further pressure on this to adopt more restrictive absentee and overseas voting rules. We've seen efforts, for instance, in North Carolina, that using the same language from the executive order are trying to implement that in their state houses. So it wouldn't just be for federal elections, it would be for local elections. So while these are still playing out, the challenges are metastasizing. And that is the third risk that we want to flag for this is that you will continue to see more work required as attorneys because it's not just the executive order, it's going to be happening in state houses all over. And with that said, Carl, I think that's all we have to say.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Brittany and John. So right now, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. We're going to open up the floor to a question and answer session. We have about 10 minutes left. So Laderica, please, if there are any questions in the chat, hand it over to you.
Yeah, I don't see anything right now, but feel free, anybody here, if you have any questions, I'll be looking for those in the chat.
Or Laderica, I think we have a small enough group that if somebody wants to just come off mute and ask a question like that, that would be great too. So.
I have one. Hi, y'all. Sorry if I missed this, but John, I heard you mention that you had one briefing a year on these things. Brittany, did you get briefings on elections when you were in the Air Force?
There is a certified election, like official on every military base and installation that basically is in charge of putting those events on. I will say from my experience, the only time that I actually remember or recall attending a briefing was when I was stationed in Qatar. And I was stationed in Okinawa and different places around the country, but the only time I can recall receiving that briefing was once. Not to say that it did not happen. I don't want to I don't want to make that accusation, but that's the only time I can remember receiving it, and it was a very, very much a brief briefing. And I'm kind of left a little bit more confused than I walked in, especially because everybody's from around the country, and everybody has the same, intentions of voting, but every state is different with their laws. And then that one instance, I was attempting to vote in a primary, and because it was so close, I was not able to, get my vote there in time. And I bring that up to say that we, in the case of special elections as well, because we have that coming up very soon with CD 18, I fear that might be an issue for them as well with the special elections.
Mm-hmm. I would also add, and Brittany, this may have been your case as well, but the thing about these election briefings too, they are all, and I've been in the Army for 19 years, every time they are given, they are always wrapped up with guidance on political activities, where that is the majority of the briefing. That says just don't say anything in uniform, and that's across multiple administrations. It's not the Democrat or Republican thing, but the biggest concern for military leadership is please don't embarrass us by making a speech in your battle dress uniform or OCPs. And by the way, here's how you vote, absentee, and that's almost thrown in as an afterthought.
Yeah, very much shared experience.
Wow. Thank you guys so much for sharing. All of this has been so helpful and good to know, and thank you for your service.
Brittany, John, I actually had a question for y'all. What can the people who are on our attendees tonight, our friends and colleagues, how can we get involved in trying to advocate for our overseas U.S. citizens and also our uniformed service members as well in this particular area. Not to put y'all on the spot or anything, but
I think right now this is a good start. This is an excellent start. I've never been a part of a conversation like this before. And when I told my members about it, they were super excited. They were like, "Oh my gosh, but like people care about us voting? Like that's great." Because usually we're the ones out there trying to, do that relational organizing and reach out to other veterans because again, like that shared experience that John and I have, like um the encouragement or the motivation to participate in civic duty by voting, it's not at the tippy top, so once you get out or you retire, like the feeling is the same, like you just kind of carry that into your civilian life. So participating in civic duty and voting is something that you really have to put an effort into. And so I believe like conversations like this and people who are not veterans, people who are not military family members talking about these things will definitely bring the people, the veterans, the military members out of the woodworks to be like, oh, okay, people are actually interested in, in hearing what we have to say, our perspective. And it's not something that should be like shunned or feel ashamed about.
Yeah, no, I would be remiss not to plug joining Common Defense, joining our listserv on to receive more information. We're certainly, this is a year where there's stuff going on across the spectrum, legally, federally, and locally that we are engaged with, as well as, and we do have a military support initiative as well. Obviously, these fights are happening through the federal circuit right now, and it seems in ordinary business it would be cut and dry for the as Carl said about the difference between executive order and statutes. It's not really open to interpretation, but we're in a different time. But I'd say, yeah, more efforts to, I'd leave with saying that regardless of what happens here, service members do need help learning about their rights as voters and looking and being entrepreneurial about how you can be a part of that. It would be certainly be appreciated by them, whether that's through the federal voting assistance program, or in your local communities with National Guard and Reserve units as well.
Well, thank you, John. Brittany, thank you so much for being here and really, like I've told you both before, I really enjoy anytime I get to work with y'all's organization. So thank you so much for being here. Everybody who's attending our presentation, thank you all so much for being here as well. Just a reminder, we are going to go ahead and post this on TCRP's YouTube channel. It usually takes about 24 to 48 hours to be up there. But Brittany, John, any last words that y'all had before we let everybody enjoy the rest of their night?
No, I appreciate the invite, and yeah, glad to see you guys on the field here for this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for inviting us again. Anytime we get to do any type of collaboration with the Texas Civil Rights Project, I'm like ready to jump up on it. And also, since I know this may be going on YouTube, just wanted to shout out to my members in Texas, affectionately named Team Tejas, because I know that they're going to be watching this on YouTube later. So they were really excited to be a part of this process. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.
One quick thing, because I know you all were plugging, or John, you were staying plugged in with Common Defense. Do people just sign up for the listserv through you all's website, just so people know where they can kind of sign up for that?
Brittany, you want to take this?
Sure, yeah. As the organizer, yes. You can join by going to the link www.commondefense.us/join. That's where our join form will be. And you do not have to be a member of the military or a veteran to join, because we have our military family engagement too. And that's taking off like a rocket in Texas. So yeah. Thank you so much. Yes, link is in the chat.
All right, perfect. Well, John, Brittany, thank you so much again, and thank you everybody here tonight. So this was the last of our Democracy Deep Dive series. Just for anybody who's been to previous presentations, it's been a real privilege and an honor of mine to be able to host these presentations. Please do look at our YouTube channel in the next coming days, see tonight's presentation and the other ones we've done before. And with that, John, Brittany, thanks again. And thank you to everybody. And have a great night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Good night, guys.
Many.